On February 4th, 1945, in the city of Yalta, Crimea at the Levadia Palace, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the leaders of these three nations gathered here to jointly establish a new world order for the post-World War II era. This was the Yalta Conference, an event that would influence the world for the next half-century. This conference was held in secret, without informing other countries. Yet the fates of many nations were silently and forever changed. And Korea, the country we're talking about today, was one of them. The name for Korea, Joseon, first appeared in the ancient Chinese text, the Classic of Mountains and Seas. The text reads, "Within the East Sea at a corner of the North Sea, there is a country named Joseon." Korea has a long and storied history. In the 7th century AD, the Silla kingdom allied with China's Tang dynasty to conquer the Goguryeo and Baekje kingdoms, unifying the Korean Peninsula. After that, Korea basically remained a unified nation, without experiencing any major periods of division. The two dynasties that followed also enjoyed long, stable reigns. The Goryeo and Joseon dynasties lasted for 474 years and 518 years, respectively. So why did Korea, a country that was unified for so long, end up splitting into the two countries that we see today? Let's turn back the clock to the late 19th century. At that time, China's Qing government and Korea still had a tributary relationship. Meanwhile, neighboring Japan was rising rapidly after the Meiji Restoration and set out on a path of foreign aggression. Its primary target was Korea. In 1894, Japan launched the first Sino-Japanese War against the Qing government. The Qing government suffered a crushing defeat and was forced to sign the infamous Treaty of Shimonoseki. Its main provision was to declare an end to the tributary relationship between China and Korea, and to recognize Korea as an independent and autonomous nation. Of course, Japan wasn't really doing this for its neighbors, to start a war for the country's independence. Related, the treaty was actually paving the way for Japan to gradually annex Korea. Shortly after the wildly expansionist Tsarist, Russia also invaded Korea, beginning a decade-long standoff with Japan. In May of 1896, Japan sent a high-ranking official to Russia for secret negotiations, proposing to use the 38th parallel north as a line to partition Korea. This was also the first time the 38th parallel appeared in history. As for the origin of the 38th parallel, there are many different stories. The main theory is that the 38th parallel north just so happened to divide Korea into two areas of roughly equal size. Faced with Japan's proposal, Tsarist Russia flatly refused. The two sides went to war in 1904 in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan was victorious. After that, with nothing holding them back, Japan forced Korea to sign the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty. And just like that, Japan annexed Korea. The Korean people began 36 years of life under colonial rule. Although their homeland was lost, the Korean people's resistance against Japan never stopped. On October 26, 1909, a Japanese elder statesman of the Meiji Restoration, Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi, arrived at the Harbin railway station. At the time, Ito Hirobumi had successfully orchestrated both the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. For this, he was held in the highest regard by the emperor. He was at the absolute peak of his career. He had come to Harbin this time to negotiate with Tsarist Russia on the matter of partitioning northeast China. As he stepped off the train, he was met with a warm welcome from an honor guard. Flush with success, he had absolutely no idea that his life was about to end. At that moment, just 10 paces away from Ito Hirobumi, a Korean Independence Army staff officer, and Young-gun was hiding in the crowd. As Ito Hirobumi passed in front of him, he quickly pulled out his pistol and fired 3 shots, killing Ito Hirobumi. The news of Hirobumi's death shocked the entire world. It also greatly inspired the Korean people's will to resist the Japanese. Many Korean soldiers refused to lay down their arms and deserted to form armed resistance forces against Japan. In 1919, the March 1st movement broke out. In 1932, the Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai orchestrated the world-shocking Hankou Park bombing. In the same year, Kim Il-sung also launched anti-Japanese guerrilla activities in northeastern China. You could say that Korea's 36-year history as a kingdom was also 36 years of resistance. But at the end of those long 36 years, what awaited them was not a bright future. Fast forward to 1945. With Japan's defeat in World War II all but certain, the world powers had their own ideas for the Korean Peninsula. Neither side wanted the other to have sole control of Korea. In 1945, on August 8th, after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, Soviet troops immediately landed in northern Korea and began pushing south. They looked poised to occupy the entire peninsula, but American forces were still busy fighting Japan in the Pacific. Under these circumstances, the U.S. State Department proposed that American troops immediately land in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula. to prevent the Soviets from occupying the entire territory. But the U.S. military said they couldn't do it, so they held an emergency meeting on August 10th and proposed using the 38th parallel as the dividing line for U.S. and Soviet forces to accept the Japanese surrender. The Soviet Union immediately agreed. This was because Stalin planned to use this concession in Korea in exchange for U.S. approval for the Soviets to occupy Hokkaido in Japan. However, the U.S. later insisted on occupying Japan alone and refused to make that concession. The separate occupations by the U.S. and the Soviet Union led to the de facto division of the Korean Peninsula. Starting in late August, the exchange of people and goods across the 38th parallel was prohibited. The railways were cut off, and in early September, communication lines were also terminated. North and South Korea were now in a state of division. At this point, we see that Korea, which could barely be considered one of the victorious nations of World War II, instead suffered a tragic division after the war, becoming a battleground for imperial ambitions. Its situation was almost as bad as that of the defeated nation Germany. The reason for this, aside from the political ambitions of the great powers, was also because Korea itself lacked an independent and autonomous government to intervene forcefully. Instead, it relied on the great powers, hoping they would help it escape colonial rule. The result was predictable. Korea once again became like a fish on the chopping block. Afterward, the US and the Soviet Union each governed their occupied zones, according to their own models. In 1948, the Republic of Korea was established in the south with Syngman Rhee as president. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established, with Kim Il-sung as its chairman. And so, a separate country emerged on each side of the 38th parallel. The constitutions of both countries clearly stated that their nation was the sole legitimate government on the Korean Peninsula, with sovereignty over the entire territory. Tensions between the two nations were running high, and they were in a state of sharp confrontation. At the same time, relations between the US and the Soviet Union were also deteriorating. The clouds of war were gathering over the Korean Peninsula. On June 7, 1950, Kim Il-sung issued an appeal to the people of North and South Korea, calling for the peaceful reunification of the country, based on a peninsula-wide general election. On June 10th, 3 representatives from the North crossed the 38th parallel, intending to deliver the appeal for peaceful reunification to the South Korean leaders. But they were quickly arrested by the South Korean government, and were soon executed for refusing to renounce their beliefs. On June 25th, North Korea, claiming it was a counterattack against an invasion, crossed the 38th parallel and launched a massive attack on South Korea. The Korean War had begun. In the early stages of the war, the North Korean People's Army seemed unstoppable. It took them just 3 days to capture the South Korean capital, Seoul. They moved so fast that Syngman Rhee was still calling on his soldiers to defend Seoul during the day, only to flee in a panic that same night. In less than a month and a half, the North Korean People's Army had occupied over 90% of the peninsula's territory and over 92% of its population. You could say this was the closest the Korean Peninsula had ever come to unification. But on July 7th, the United Nations Security Council passed the famous Resolution 84. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Greece, Turkey, Colombia, Thailand, the Philippines, South Africa, and Ethiopia. The UN forces composed of troops from these 16 nations officially entered the conflict. The United Nations Command was placed under the unified command of the United States and was authorized to use the United Nations flag in combat against the North Korean People's Army. This caused the Korean War, which had started as a civil war, to rapidly expand in scale. On September 15th, the United Nations forces under the command of MacArthur launched a large-scale landing at Incheon Harbor. At this time, almost all of North Korea's main forces were concentrated on the Busan front. Caught in a pincer attack from the north and south, their troops were routed. On September 25th, UN forces recaptured Seoul. The tide had turned on the Korean Peninsula. American warplanes even entered mainland Chinese airspace and bombed the city of Dandong in Liaoning province. Almost every day, China broadcast warnings to the United States, stating that if they crossed the 38th parallel, China would send troops. But these warnings were all ignored by the United States. At the time, China had just endured many years of war. It was a poor, backward agricultural nation devastated by war. The United States, on the other hand, was the most powerful industrial nation. As the leader of the 17-nation coalition, they simply didn't believe China would pose much of a threat. On October 7th, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 376, declaring the intention to unify the Korean Peninsula. On that very day, American forces crossed the 38th parallel. By the end of October, the United nation's forces had wiped out most of the North Korean People's Army, pushing the front line back to the China-Korea border. In the eyes of the UN soldiers, the war was nearly over. They would be home by Christmas. But when they reached their destination, they found that what was waiting for them was not an easy victory, but an entirely unexpected army. The real war had only just begun. On October 25th, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army's 118th Division of the 40th Corps fired the first shot of the Resist America Aid Korea campaign. The United Nations forces had no idea. The volunteer army had already crossed the Yalu River and were caught completely by surprise. They made a full retreat to south of the Chongshan River. During the retreat, because the Syngman Rhee government embezzled supplies, 90,000 South Korean soldiers lacking provisions died in the harsh winter. The first phase offensive ended in a complete victory for the volunteer army. In the 3 years that followed, the volunteer army engaged in several more campaigns against the UN forces. These included the famous Battle of Chosin Reservoir, the Battle of Samsori, and the Battle of Triangle Hill. These battles dealt a heavy blow to the morale of the UN forces. The entire coalition front line was shaken to varying degrees. The coalition's high command gradually realized that the Chinese army was invincible. The disgraced MacArthur. It was difficult to accept this reality. He repeatedly petitioned Truman, requesting to use nuclear bombs on northeast China to cut off the volunteer army's supply lines. But the United States, wary of the Soviet Union's power, feared a Soviet counterattack, or even a direct invasion of Western Europe, which could trigger a Third World War. So the proposal was rejected. The front line eventually became a seesaw battle along the 38th parallel. Both sides realized that continuing to fight wouldn't significantly change the outcome. So they returned to the negotiating table. In 1953, on July 27th, both sides signed the Korean Armistice Agreement in Panmunjom. The division between North and South Korea has remained to this day. When we look back on this period of history today, we find that South Korea and North Korea were originally one country, one people. They lived together for thousands of years with the same culture and the same history. But in recent decades, they were forcibly separated, leading to division and confrontation. The longer they're apart, the greater the differences become. The rift between the two countries grows deeper from the official level down to the common people. A strong sense of hostility permeates everything. Along the short 248-kilometer 38th parallel, millions of soldiers are stationed, surrounded by all kinds of artillery and radar. It almost makes you forget that the people on the other side of the barbed wire were once family. The division and unification of a people is an eternal theme in this world. Besides North and South Korea, there was East and West Germany, South and North Vietnam, and for us, mainland China and Taiwan. Setting aside the complex political realities, and speaking purely from a place of simple national sentiment, hope that all separated families in the world can be reunited, that all estranged brothers can reconcile, and that all separated compatriots can come together again. Before the Berlin Wall came down, nobody believed it would ever fall. After the Berlin Wall came down, nobody could believe it had ever stood there in the first place. And that's the main topic of this video. If you enjoyed it, we hope you'll subscribe. Please also like and share. Your support really means a lot to us.